My guest today is a partner in Deloitte Cyber Risk Advisory and leads the smart cities and local government agenda nationally. He's amassed over 20 years' experience in cyber risk security domains and emerging technology, and has particular expertise in smart cities and infrastructure, connected transport, and digital health. He serves on Deloitte's IoT executive with a particular interest in emerging technology risk. He's also the co-founder and chief executive officer of IoTSec Australia, an industry advocacy and research initiative to promote secure practices in the IoT ecosystem across smart cities, infrastructure, utilities, and health. Lani Refiti, welcome to FireTech Connect.
Thank you, Lee, and thank you for those kind words of introduction. I couldn't have written them better myself.
Very good. So Lani, we live in interesting times. I've really been looking forward to having a conversation with you. I've got a number of talking points around the whole cybersecurity challenge that we face. Mm-hmm. Smart cities.
Yes.
I want to talk to you about some of the issues. I've been reading recently about smart cities, and I think the emergence of digital health is another really interesting one that
yes,
we want to cover off. But let's start with cybersecurity. I mean, I think I get the feeling that we've had a fairly lackadaisical approach to cybersecurity. I've been involved in the web since '92 when the web first emerged. And I have to admit that I've probably been one that hasn't taken the risk perhaps as seriously as we should. Now, Zoom, let's talk about Zoom for a minute. We're on Zoom, and Zoom had 10 million active users late last year, I think, in their December quarter. And then recent indicate that there's 340 or 350 million active users.
Correct.
That's exponential growth.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, I personally have had some experience with Zoom bombing.
Mm-hmm.
They seem to have addressed that. But that exponential growth in the use of the internet, what impact does that have on cybersecurity?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and it's heartening to talk to someone who's been involved in the web since '92. So you were back in the Netscape, Lycos, Alta Vista days, Magellan. Wow, okay.
You're making me feel really old now.
But you are right. I mean, that little summary you gave, the exponential growth in terms of let's just say web activity has had a really big impact on cybersecurity. And to give you an idea, look, a lot of companies these companies that we work with have 5,000, 10,000 employees. A lot of them I would talk to say, look, the projects that we had to basically implement would usually take us 6 to 9 months in terms of a proper business project planned out, implementation of moving that number of staff to home remote work. They did in like a week and a half. And so, of course, they said we had to cut corners because the necessity was there, right? And so for most organization, it was rushed, and they just had to do it because of the pandemic. They couldn't have anyone in their offices, and they did to their credit. Most organizations were able to do that successfully, and Zoom, WebEx, whatever platform that you're using, the exponential growth in that is sort of testament to that, being able to move millions of people to remote work in the space of a week and a half. Now, so from a cyber perspective, what that's done is basically, unfortunately, people have cut corners to do it, and that's that's unfortunately as a matter of fact. You simply couldn't follow the proper security steps and get that done in such a short period of time. Security does add a slow inertia, does add a bit of lag time to whatever project you're doing. But they were able to do that. They have cut corners in order to do that. And now we're just going around, basically assessing and finding out what those corners were cut and what the impacts will be going forward.
So when we talk about breach, obviously there are protocols that, from a cybersecurity reporting perspective, and I think a lot of companies that I talk to have no idea what to do in the case of a breach. Who do I report it to? And from the perspective of, say, an early stage company that has a web service or a web platform, and that gets breached, and some of their customer information is accessed, or in some cases it's unknown what has been impacted and what hasn't been impacted. What's the protocol around that?
Yeah, look, and you're right. A lot of small businesses, what you're talking about is a law that we have called mandatory breach disclosure. It's not the exact name, but it's basically what it is. If you fall within certain guidelines, if your turnover is over a certain amount, I think it's about $3.5 million, and you hold customer data, and you've had a what they call a serious breach, an impactful breach, then by law you now have to report that to the reporting agencies, and you have to report that to the customers whose data have been lost, and then you need to make obviously remediation to do that. So that is for large organizations who can afford to have who can outsource that to organizations like I work for, or who'll have their own internal teams, lawyers, public relations to do that. A breach is never a good thing, but at least they have a plan, what they usually call an incident response plan, a crisis management plan. But for a lot of the smaller startups, etc., a lot of smaller organizations, who may have 10 people, 20 people at most, that is a lot of bureaucratic overhead and regulatory overhead that they've got to go through. And they have to do it, right? Because the fines, you can be fined as an individual, as a director of that company, or the organization itself can be fined, and the fines can be quite hefty, can be run into the millions of dollars. So it's the protocol is you do have to be aware of what your sort of legal and regulatory sort of obligations are, and then on top of that, you've got to then worry about having the actual capability to do the assessment of what happened, what customer data was either stolen or leaked inadvertently, and then go through the process of reporting that to the reporting agency as well as to the customers themselves. So you've got to worry about that as a small business or a startup. And then on top of that, you got to worry about the hackers as well who are trying to get to that data. So it is a difficult. It places startups, it places small businesses in a really difficult and vulnerable position.
So when you talk about serious breaches, when I think about some of the software and platforms, I've been involved in building or working with. A lot of it sometimes is sort of innocuous customer data. It's names and, maybe phone numbers, maybe an email address. But in some cases, you're holding, it could be identification, passport information, copies of driver's license, etc. I mean, what's the, is there sort of like a level that says, hey, this is a serious breach because of the nature of the information in there versus, well, it's only a bit of customer data? And then the second part of that question is for an early stage company that says, well, it was only a bit of customer data. I'm not going to worry about, letting my customers know that because I don't want to upset the apple cart. It's taken me so long to get those customers. The last thing I need to do is go and say, hey, my trust, the trust that we've built has just been breached.
Yeah. Look, and a lot of the times, right, and I work with one small operator here on the Sunshine Coast where I live, just giving them some advice. And, I talked it over with the founder. He was concerned exactly about the same thing. He had, a small subset of customers. I think it was under 100. And the concern he had was, I don't know how serious this is because I don't have the resources to actually do the assessment myself. I don't want to pay you, Deloitte, to come in, 20,000 minimum to come in and do that assessment because I don't have that. And I'm afraid I'm going to lose my customers if I do tell them that I believe I've suffered a breach. So, and I think awareness and knowing, what the risks are, what the rewards are, and then being able to make an informed decision, I think is really important. So talking through with him in terms of what the potential ramifications were if he was fined by the privacy commissioner to the tune of $3 million versus customers finding out and leaving his early stage startup. And then what we settled on was the fact that if he was open and upfront and transparent with his customers, that act itself would actually build trust. If you went to them proactively and said, look, this is what's happened, this is what we've enacted to mitigate it, and apologize, etc., that would be the best course of action. And so after sort of talking through all the ramifications with him, he made that decision, and it ended up being the right one for him, because he both met his obligations to report it to the reporting agencies, and the clients that he worked with basically turned around and said, thank you. You were honest and transparent with my data, which was important. It was name, address, financial details, etc. And I don't believe he lost any clients during that. I don't know now, given COVID and tourism, but you know, it's that's a good, I guess, story. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, it doesn't always happen that way.
So trust is an important thing. But I mean, just to talk about that, you know, there are actively hackers out there hacking into web platforms, trying to you know, get access to the data,
Mm-hmm.
and then essentially holding that over the early
Yeah.
stage company,
Yeah.
and this sort of blackmail thing. So I mean,
Mm-hmm.
talk to us about what that is, and you know, how do you work through that type of it?
And it's actually become more simpler for the hacker, right? It used to be that, you know, there was a lot of work. It was expensive for them to, you know, hack into a company's platform, exfiltrate or steal the data, and then basically hold you over for ransom to get that data back. Nowadays, it's very easy. We have this scourge. I call it a scourge called ransomware, which is, rather than going through the whole rigmarole of trying to get into your organization, you know, escalate privileges, find the data, steal it, they just send you a piece of malware, which is, think of it as the old computer virus term, and which, once you execute it, basically goes searching through your computers, your network computers, etc., storage platforms, and encrypts everything. So, you know, it encrypts everything, and then basically will reach out to you and say, unless you pay us, typically it's around the $4,000, you know, $5,000 mark, you won't get your data back. And if you think of, you know, businesses like medical centers, even startups who have, you know, their customer databases, etc., all of a sudden unavailable to them, you know, that could be an existential threat to them. Now, the good news is that most of the organizations that I've worked with that have paid ransom, I would say 95% of them get the encryption key to decrypt their data, right? Which is, and I would not suggest that you do that, you pay ransom, but for some organizations, again, after they go through the whole thought process, it's like, well, it's either I pay the $4,000 or I go out of business, you know. So for them, it can be a pretty sort of nasty decision. But the good news is, for most organizations that I've worked with that have paid ransoms, they do get their data back. And for the pure fact that for the hacker, it's a business model. So if it gets out that they are, you know, not you know, living up to their end of the bargain, people would not pay ransom. So people are more likely to pay a ransom if they know that they're going to get their data back. So it's actually, you know, if you look at it from a purely from a business perspective, it's a pretty good business model, if not a morally corrupt one.
That's right. But it's, you know, it as you're talking, it sort of reminds me of the drug wars and the Mexican cartels.
Yeah.
You know, they I suppose the question that arises is, you know, what are we doing to combat this, and what does the future look like in terms of what are the other things that we can do? Because I guess the reference to the drug war is that the more that the FDA in the US took action, the cartels were one step ahead, three steps ahead. They you know, they stopped them coming across the border, so they dug tunnels. They tried to stop the tunnels, so then they got submarines. It's like, where do you see it ending, or doesn't it?
Yeah, look, and one thing I'll add to what I said before. That's a great question. One thing I'll add is that it's getting you know, much more easier for the attacker, for the hacker, and much more harder for the defender or the good guys. And the reason being is, with technology going the way it is and everything being automated, like it used to be that you know, to actually hack into somebody's you know, web platform or computer or whatever it is, you had to actually be physically sitting there on the computer doing it. But a lot of that is scripted, it's automated. You know, a lot of the hacking that's done, the ransomware that's implanted these days, is all automated, requires no sort of human interaction. And so from a business perspective, if you were, you know, if you and I were of that ilk, you know, we could make quite a bit of money without actually expending a lot to do that. And so, which leads into the answer to your question in terms of what can we do? It's actually, you know, I liken it to you know, defenders. The challenge we have as defending customers and defending customer platforms is that we have to get it right 100% of the time, whereas attackers or hackers, you know, they only have to get it right once. You know, in terms of, all you need is one exploit, one hole for an attacker to get in, and then they're in. So we have to be right 100% of the time, which is, as you know, it's impossible, right? So as it's almost like a bit of an arms race. As we as defenders create new technology to come up with, new defenses, etc. Attackers are just finding new and novel ways to bypass them. Some of them quite simple in nature, right? Like the ransomware attacks, very, very difficult to defend against, and it's very, very easy for a hacker to implement and to execute that kind of attack. So, in terms of technology, we're starting to get into the domain of, we're using advanced analytics, machine learning, etc. Eventually, it'll move to AI to combat malware. But again, it's a bit of an arms race, because on the attacker side, they're going down the same route, using exactly the same, technology to try and find ways to bypass our defenses.
Yeah, it's interesting around. I think I had this conversation with someone the other day, talking about the Zoom bombing and people hacking, and don't take this the wrong way. I mean, I can understand the idea of hacking to get personal information. I'm not condoning it, but I can sort of understand it. It's like, I'm hacking in there, I'm going to get personal information, I'm going to steal that person's identity, and I'm going to go and access their bank accounts or whatever. I can understand that. But some of these hacks and some of these Zoom bombings just seem to be senseless, mindless. Is that all they are, or is there more to it?
Pretty much. I mean, you get, if you're going to steal information in order to make a monetary gain, financial gain out of it, they're criminals, right? And criminals, particularly if they're after money or financial gain, they will, have a pretty much a plan to do it. They're not going in there just to destroy something. They actually want to take something of value. But you do get people. Zoom bombing is a perfect example. It makes no sense, right? They don't get any financial gain out of it. It's purely just for kicks. And then you just have to go back to human nature. Like, senseless violence. Like, why do people commit acts of senseless violence? And you've seen, looting and violence in the US, etc., across their cities. Why do people do it when they're destroying their own, cities and towns, etc.? Human nature, unfortunately. It's just the nature of the beast. And the same thing happens in the digital world around things like Zoom bombing. Some of the material that they share while Zoom bombing, like, you'd have to be pretty sick to get any sort of pleasure, or you think that's funny. But it, unfortunately, just human nature. It happens.
It's a little bit like, I suppose, in our day in the 70s when we were kids, we used to play knock knock, run around the neighborhood.
Yeah, exactly. Knocking. Yeah.
It was sort of innocent fun and just annoying to people.
Yep. But now it's escalated.
It's sort of like the cyber version of knock knock, right?
Yes. Yeah. So, whereas, I'm sure we thought back in those days it was harmless fun, but our parents or those on the receiving end were like, who would do such a thing?
That's right. Yeah. If only it was as innocuous as knock knock now. So I want to talk about smart cities. Over the last 5 years in my travels, I've spoken to a lot of people around smart cities, been to quite a few smart cities conferences. You and I have a mutual friend in Dr. Scott Burke, who's a big advocate of smart cities and doing some amazing work down at Logan. But I was reading some information. It's actually in the Green New Deal, Jeremy Rifkin's new book, the author of the Third Industrial Revolution. And he cites a case in there, which I thought was interesting, around Sidewalk Labs in Toronto, where the Canadian government essentially went out and took some of the harbourside land to turn it into this, state-of-the-art, futuristic, smart city. And they partnered with Google. And the data security that came out of that, and the detail of granular data that was being able to sort of potentially be mined from that, essentially bogged this whole project down. Do you have any insight into that, or sort of help understand what happened there?
I actually did some work back in the day, about 4 years ago, on the Sidewalk Labs project when I was at a previous organization, and even back then, when we looked at it, the challenge was always going to become Alphabet, which is Google's parent company. They're in advertising, right? And again, I'm not being critical of them as an organization. It's what they do. They deal in data, and they trade data, and that's how they make money. And so there was always going to be, right back then, and I think even Sidewalk Labs knew it, because they brought on a lot of sort of privacy heavyweights to sort of help allay the concerns. Even back then, you could see that there was going to be, at some stage, it was going to come to a head where the data that was collected, that is the valuable part of it, right? And what makes it more valuable is to be able to trade that, is be able to enrich it with data from elsewhere, is to be able to, give it to third parties or sell it to third parties to, so they can enrich it, etc. That was always going to be the issue, because you don't, as a company like Sidewalk Labs, you don't invest tens of millions, maybe even hundreds of millions of dollars into something if you don't see a return out of it, right? And Sidewalk Labs was going to be basically the first greenfield site that really showcased smart cities technology as well as data analytics. They had some really cool tech around. Google was going to be able to consume enough data to be able to do a lot of predictive analysis. So think of walking down the street, etc., and having all the technology, the lighting, the CCTV, the waste, etc., all sort of basically shaped to the citizens of that city. Sidewalk Labs. That was the promise of it. It was going to improve people's lives in terms of the way they work and live and play there, and it was going to be green in terms of sustainability, environmental sustainability. That was the promise, and the technology was there to do that. The challenge was always in what happens when people don't want their data to be used. What happens if they don't want technology to know where they're going to be before they even decide themselves where they're going to go based on their prior sort of history. And I'm not sure if you read recently, but actually Google just pulled out of that project.
Yes.
This was about 2 or 3 weeks ago. So it was always going to be that challenge, and I don't think we've overcome that tension between privacy and our need as individuals to keep our data private, and versus our need for our lives to be improved by technology. So that I find has always been the tension, and you'll get that tension in whatever smart cities project you come across, even the ones here in Australia. But they're much less mature stage, but they will eventually get to that stage of how do you protect user data and protect that sense of privacy versus how do you enable technology, or how does technology enable them to have a better life and have an easier life without knowing all that data. The typical thing I find is like Google search, right? People love the fact that Google search and predictive search helps you find anything very, very quickly, usually on the first page. You don't usually have to go to page 2, 3, or 4 to find what you want. But in order to do that, Google needs to collect a lot of information in terms of what you look for, what you're buying, et cetera, et cetera. So it's
really?
always that, tension. Yeah.
Look, I agree. I think one of the quotes in the article that was around that announcement actually is that says you'll have to have a city that's based on or built around proprietary platforms, data harvesting, and corporate control.
Which is not the it won't meet the needs of of an open, transparent type city, right? And therein lies the challenge. The challenge will always be that, like, how do we get technology, open data? How do we get open sort of trusted platforms? And then when people's data in terms of their personal identifiable information are on those platforms, how do we protect that? And we haven't solved that yet. I mean, there's some sort of new tech. People throw up, blockchain will be able to help. And it's like, well, yes, from a very low level technical perspective, but we still haven't overcome it. And I think one of the things you originally raised was around trust. And I think what it boils down to is, at the end of the day, is trust.
I think the COVID-19 thing has raised a couple of really interesting things, and it probably touches around the telemedicine and electronic health.
Mm-hmm.
There's two cases that I found and followed with some interest. The number one was in China, where they're using face recognition. Now, that's been controversial for some time. Again, we've got privacy issues, but here we've got a communist authoritarian government essentially saying, "Bad luck, we're using it." Right? Yeah. It's for the better of society. In I suppose our more democratic, or sometimes I wonder whether we are actually in a democratic world, but in that democratic, as you say, we have that tension between it, where we constantly have that debate, even to the point where it's for the betterment of the health and society more broadly. So do we take that Orwellian sort of approach and say, we're implementing it? So the face recognition, I'm interested in your comments on, and then I'll touch on the COVID app in Australia.
Yes. Yeah. Look, facial recognition. Fundamentally, most of the clients I've spoken to in a smart cities context, most of the cities that I work with, councils, local governments, etc., CCTV and facial recognition is probably one of the top 5 projects. After smart waste, parking, that kind of stuff. And the reason why it's top of the agenda is that fundamentally people want to be safe in our cities. We want to be able to walk down by the waterfront with our kids on a Saturday night, and we want to have a sense of security, have a sense of safety, and that can help engender that. On the flip side, it can be used in quite nefarious ways, as you've noted, right? There's examples overseas where that does happen. And they go even further. You're able to use facial recognition to find out what people are doing, and ultimately it lends to a behavioral score of some sort. And you get access to housing, and you can access to travel if your behavioral score is based on is good, versus if it's not, you don't have access to all that. So that is the Orwellian 1984 type end state that we get to. But the challenge is, especially with facial recognition, there is a security use case which is wholly valid, and people want. I want to be able to go down to Noosa on the weekend and at night and feel safe that I'm not going to be mugged, or et cetera, et cetera. So there is that use case which is wholly valid. The trick, if you want to call it that, is to keep that use case very narrow, without organizations trying to expand that outside of that scope. So
there's a trade-off, right? That's the thing. You're saying, in one instance, I want to be able to go down and walk along the boardwalk on a Saturday evening with my family and feel secure. So I need to feel secure, versus having my face recognized, put into a database, and then potentially used in other ways that I'm not consenting to, or potentially getting into the hands of hackers and using in more nefarious ways, as you say.
Yeah, correct. There is a trade-off, and ultimately, if you look at it, if government has, if your local council has collected that data, you can be sure that at some point, if there was an emergency or whatever it is, the state or the federal authorities would want access to that data as well. And you have, even people think that that's future, you were looking ahead. But if you look at a city like Brisbane, right, you can't actually get outside the city centre without you being tracked by CCTV. Now, I'm not saying that they use facial recognition, but they could essentially follow you across the city. Yes, they could essentially follow you across the city, just using CCTV cameras like in Queen Street Mall and the different places, etc. So as you can see, it wouldn't take a giant leap in order to start overlaying, facial recognition on top of that, and to be able to see where you go, where you stop, where you shop, etc. And by the time you start tying in those different data points in terms of even your financial transactions, etc., you can build quite a really good profile of a citizen, what they do throughout the day. And again, I'm not saying that Brisbane City Council do that at all. I'm just saying that, thinking future, that could be done.
Yes, I think that's a sort of a good segue into the next part of it, which was the furor, if you like, the debate that emerged over the COVID-19 government app.
Yes,
right?
yeah.
Now, as I mentioned, I'm sort of old school, early web technologies. We worked out pretty early, probably in the mid-90s, that we could capture data through a website, and we could also identify and track to some level traffic to that page, albeit at the time fairly rudimentary compared to what we've got today.
Yeah.
But then as we evolved with those web technologies, I saw those evolve from the sort of the early to mid 90s into the early 2000s, and then sort of around 2004-5 was involved in marketing automation, and implementing wide-scale marketing automation for large corporations in Australia through one of my companies. And at that point, the technology was there that we could see pretty much everything around your activities. We could automate and trigger follow-up emails. We could put them into buckets. We could wait for 7 days. We could see which pages, what you consumed, how long you were there for, when you went back, how many times you went back. And then we could trigger automation around all of those activities. We could score them and essentially we knew exactly what you were doing, what you were looking at, what you were interested in. So this is back in the early 2000s, right? I've been out of that game for a while now, but I know and understand through social media what is possible, what is tracked, as you mentioned. Google, the algorithms, they need to, in order to, if you've been on and looking for, recording studio equipment and then get onto Facebook and then get presented, surprise, surprise,
yeah,
by some really cool studio equipment. So what's your take on that? Around the concern of, we're not downloading an app, I'm not giving away my data. I'm saying, are you on Facebook? Are you on Twitter?
I sit in that camp, right? I think at the end of the day, I mean, in an ideal world, of course, you wouldn't be giving this, this data to the federal government, particularly if it ties into your, potential health, details and information about yourself. In a perfect world, in an ideal time, you wouldn't do that. But, we've had a pandemic, people global, the US, I think is up to 120,000 people have died from COVID. So in sort of desperate times, you take desperate measures. That's one thing. On the other hand, you're right. If you use Facebook, if you have the Facebook app on your phone, that collects much more data about you than the COVID app does, right? So again, it's that, it's that choice you've got to make, and the fact that already you are, through your apps, Instagram, Facebook apps, etc., your searches on your smartphone, the social media companies have a much more richer profile of you than the government would ever get out of your COVID-19 app. So that's the way I looked at it. I use it, and and I encourage people to use it because it was a tool for a specific time, and hopefully we're coming up to a time where we don't have to use that anymore. But that the way I see it, it's I thought it was quite a lot of people sort of libertarian leanings, sort of up in arms about the government having this data. It's like, well, private companies who are actually trying to sell you things and where you are the product have much more sort of rich profile of you. So yeah.
I think that's a really interesting point. You are the product, and I think that's the thing that people miss is that you are the product. You have been the product for a long time. In fact, since the beginning of the web, you have been the product, and I can say that quite categorically with experience. So Amazon, Google, Facebook, all of these social platforms, you are the product. The irony for me was that people on LinkedIn saying, with a LinkedIn profile, saying, I will never part with any of my information to any government application.
Well, their LinkedIn profile is fully fleshed out, right? Yeah. And we talk about trade-off. Yes, we are the product, right? But again, it's a trade-off, and it's quite simple. If we didn't want access to all this, we could just ditch our smartphone or delete all the apps off it. But I can tell you 10 out of 10 people wouldn't do that because we want access to the data. We want access to these apps and smartphones that make our lives more simpler, right? And that's the trade-off that you've got to take. And, a lot of people are up in arms when you tell them that, well, if something's free and you're not paying for the service, well, obviously you are the product, right? Your data is what's paying for it. And they get all upset about it, but that is true. I mean, how else are these companies? If you look at companies like Google, Facebook, etc., they're not doing it out of the kindness of their heart in terms of connecting people and giving you a rich experience. They're doing it because they're we're all well, most of us capitalists. We're doing it because there is a trade between a good and a service, and you buying it. And if you're not buying it, then you're providing your data or your details in order to pay for it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's one of the favorite things I have. Saying to a lot of the early stage companies I work with when they say they're either going to use a loss leader to attract customers or they're going to give it away for free. And I say to them, nothing is free. And, I know that's a long, well-used expression, but, the point that I'm making to them is that if you give your time away to a customer with the view that you're going to get that back in return, that may well be the case, but don't do it under the misguided that it's free. Right? Because somebody's paying. You're paying for it.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah, and whether it's your time or whether it's your business or whether it's a platform that you built, you're exactly right.
You are paying for it. Someone's paying for it, and if they're not paying for it, than you are. And you know, if you're giving away your services person's time to help fix a customer problem for 3 hours,
Yeah.
and you're saying, and you know, they love saying, oh, but I gave that away for free. Well,
Yeah.
no, you didn't.
No, you didn't, because the expectation is, right, they're going to be happy with this. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right.
And I
So,
don't think, you know, if you did really think that it's for free, then I would say that business is not for you. Like, if that's really what you think, that you're giving away something for free, then perhaps you shouldn't be in business.
well, I think it comes out of this whole idea of build it and they'll come, you know. And I think that again, the late '90s has a lot of responsibility for that, because it was very much, you know, what we're doing is we're going to go and build our database, we're going to build our customer base, we're going to use this freemium model, and then at some stage in the future we'll turn it on and start monetizing. And you know, that's obviously a fairly risky and, in my view, fundamentally flawed model. Because it's similar to the sort of the WeWorks and the Ubers of the world, where we're just saying, you know, we're not going to be profitable. We're just going to keep plowing capital into it, building global domination, and then all of a sudden go, actually, you know what? This is not a profitable model.
No, it's not. But and you know, it's probably digressing from the cyber thing. But from a business perspective, if you look at, you know, WeWork, Uber, etc. I'm sure the founders or, you know, the financial backers are thinking at some point, we're going to flip this. So we won't be left with the financial sort of ramifications of it. We're just going to build a subscriber base so large that we're going to either IPO, we're going to cash out, or someone's going to buy us. And we won't have to worry about what happens in, you know, 5 years' time. Let's worry about just, and, you know, the crude way of saying it, let's just pump and dump, you know, in terms of build this thing up and then we'll flip it or sell it or IPO it. Yeah. So, but there is a plan, I would say.
Well, there's definitely a plan, because they're building, you know, liquidation preferences into their term sheets, right? There's only one reason you have a liquidation preference in your term sheet, and that's is because you're protecting the downside as well, so that if you know, the shit does hit the fan, so to speak, then, you know, you're first in line.
Correct.
So, but you know, again, that's a pretty good segue into the idea of risk. And you know, we were talking offline about the fire tech program, and what we're trying to do there is help, you know, companies that are working in fire technologies and or have a use case to help prevent, predict, manage the catastrophic effect of fires, which we, you know, I know we're in pandemic world at the moment, but it's not very long before we're going to be in fire territory again. In fact, there's already been some fires started in some places. But what's interesting there is that, you know, we talk about the early stage companies, startups that, you know, need help commercializing and building some skills and capability. But then on the other side is that sort of the buy side, the procurement side. And you know, as you know, in enterprise sales, very complex sales cycles, lots of stakeholders, lots of people involved. It's not a transactional sort of direct sales approach. And it even sort of heightens that to another level of complexity when you're dealing with governments, because you're dealing with predominantly the risk component. And one of the interesting questions that keeps coming up and has come out, and when I'm talking to my wife about some of the interesting technologies that I'm talking to on a weekly basis, and she keeps saying, why aren't we using that?
Yes.
Right? So that's my question for you. Why aren't we using some of these promising technologies, particularly when they're in, you know, around catastrophic fires and
It's a great question, and it's really relevant to the cyber world as well, in terms of why don't we use these technologies? Tech isn't the problem, right? It's usually the convincing boards, convincing executives, convincing buyers to actually use them. And I would say that there's a theory that was that came out of Harvard Business School by a gentleman by the name of Daniel Kahneman. He wrote the book Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. Anyway, he comes up with this thing called prospect theory, and it comes out of behavioral economics. And prospect theory basically says that if for gains, we are risk takers. You know, in terms of, if I said to you, you know, Lee, I've got $20 here, I'll give this to you, but otherwise you can take the coin flip. If you get heads, you get $40, but if you get tails, you lose it all. You know, and prospect theory tells us through research that 7 out of 10 times you will say, I'll take that risk, kind of thing, because I'm looking to gain something. But on the flip side, if I said, Lee, I'm going to take $20 out of your pocket, and if I'll toss the coin. If you don't want me to toss the coin, I'll give it back to you. But if you toss the coin and lose, then I'll take an extra $20 off you. And 7 times out of 10, research tells us that you will take the risk-averse option, and you'll go, actually, no, I won't take the coin toss. I'll take my $20 back. So I use that as a prism to look through at this issue in terms of clients when it comes to something of loss. Fire, cyber, etc. is a good example. They are much more risk averse at taking risks. So it becomes a much harder sell. And it's not just the tech. It definitely is not just the tech. I mean, I was talking to a startup this morning, US-based one. They've got fantastic technology around DDoS, so protection, denial of service protection. They do it in a very unique, different way from the different providers that are out there at the moment. But they're finding it extremely difficult to get cut through, and for the big banks, etc., to even look at them, because the banks, etc., when it comes to cyber technology, and it's similar to fire, they go really risk averse and will buy from the big brands, the big names. They get really conservative when it comes to that. So I would say that buying psychology and that fits a lot into that. And so you as a person, if you've got a technology or if you've got a product that you're selling in this space, it's more than the bells and whistles on your solution. You've got to look at how the organization procures. Who are the key stakeholders you've got to get across. It becomes a much more sort of difficult sales process.
So how does an early stage company deal with that? It's a challenge, right? Because as you say, and I know from experience, having gone to enterprise with early cloud computing back in the early 2000s, 9 out of 10 pitches would end in, there's no way we're putting our data in the cloud, exactly. In a server. It ain't going to happen, right? But just with sheer determination and I suppose belief, because I understood the technologies, I understood the platforms, and to me it was a no-brainer that that web technologies we were using in what I call the consumer web part of the history was going to be transposed into enterprise. Just the simple economics of software development, delivery, platform compatibility, version control, all of those things meant that that's where it was going to go. And so we persisted. And then by sort of, I suppose at 2007, 8, 9, it started to break, and then it flipped completely. And then we saw the acceleration.
Yes.
And it adoption. Is that, it's the diffusion of innovation curve in real time, right? But in the case of, so that was sort of 10 years from start to finish, or, maybe not quite 10 years, of where all of a sudden 9 out of 10 conversations had flipped with how do we get our data into a cloud, and then the questions, is it secure? What's the risk? What's the redundancies, et cetera. But we started having meaningful conversations, and then we saw corporates and we saw governments adopting. We don't have the luxury of time in some of these more, time critical things with fires. And so I guess the question I'm getting to is, when we talk to an early stage company that has this really cool satellite technology to detect a fire and predict it, and we know that the quicker we can detect it and the quicker we can snuff it out, that's the best prevention of all, right? To stop it becoming a big fire. Yet that company is still bashing their head against the wall in the procurement side. And they're saying, well, no, we've got people in towers with binoculars. We're good for that. Yeah.
Look, one of the things I didn't mention in my bio is that I do work with Deloitte Ventures, which is Deloitte's venture capital arm. I advise them on emerging tech startups, particularly in the cyber space. And one of the things I've found over the last 3 years in working and advising our ventures team is that what they do really well is they find an interesting niche, startup that meets all the financial requirements that we have as a firm for investment. And then if we're successful in onboarding them, we basically not only invest in them from as an investment vehicle, we also then take them to market as part of Deloitte's kit tool and kit bag. So I guess what I'm saying is finding a partner or finding a partnership that would help where the partnership is strong in doing something. So we have, hundreds of clients nationally. We interact with boards, executives really well, etc. So that's our, I guess, what we bring to those startups is not just what we invest in them, but we can take you into the boardrooms of corporate Australia and we can make introductions, etc. And I think a lot of startups, that's what they're missing. They go and try and bash their head against the door with everyone else trying to get into organizations. And I think building partnerships with, and I'm not saying Deloitte is the all and be all, but building partnerships where your partner can take you to certain segments of the market, make introductions, etc., where you normally wouldn't be able to get to, I think shortens that procurement cycle, shortens that sales cycle. And again, as you've described, the tech may be really cool, and you may be able to even demonstrate that saves lives and saves time, but that still won't get you, across the line. There are other factors at play that you've got to, tick off.
Yeah, so maybe what we need to do, Lani, is FireTech Connect need to talk to you, Deloitte, and your ventures team and work out how we can partner with you to help some of our companies access some of those boardrooms and some of those government organisations.
I think it's actually a worthy discussion because a lot of VCs go direct to to startups, or will attend pitch fests, or etc. And I think there's a better way of doing it, right? There's a better way for VCs to actually get access to the best technology and the best founders and the best startups without going out individually and speaking to every one of them.
Yeah. So just to wrap up, mate, I could sit here and talk to you for hours. I find all this cyber and all the risk and technology is, something that I suppose I've lived all my life, and it's always been a challenge to me. Both from how do you get early tech into a company? How do you deal with all of the potential risks that you're exposing yourself to as a technology or a software development company? I mentioned to someone the other day when, we used to sit around as, starry-eyed 20-year-olds back at the beginning of the internet, saying about how one day everyone was going to be connected and it was going to be like the Jetsons. That was an old cartoon for people that don't get that reference.
Oh, I used to watch that.
Yeah,
meet George Jetson.
That's the one.
Yeah.
So this idea that we were going to be flying in, flying cars and on video, but I just remember, having these meetings where we were going to have convergence of the technologies and the internet, and everybody was going to be on the internet. And then over the next 25 years or so, we've sort of slowly seen the building of that infrastructure. And then it felt to me like there was that point in time where we flicked the switch and said, righto, let's get everyone on this thing and let's see how it handles it, And it seemed to me that COVID sort of shutdown moment was that moment in history where we really tested the capacity of the internet that we'd built.
Well, I mean, there's the old saying, necessity is the mother of all invention, right? And that was essentially the COVID moment, which was, there was no, and to go back what I said originally, there was no time to do the 6 to 9 month, implementation of moving everyone to remote work. You basically had to do it, or either you were out of business or your people got sick, etc. So you're right. It's the necessity and the fact that it had to be done. And it meant that things like cyber, which in an ideal world, we would do it well, plan it out, build it by design within a solution. It meant that you had to basically cut corners to get there. And is that the right thing? Well, the fact that we've been able to do it and do it fairly successful, I think would say that, at the end of the day, it probably was the right thing to do. But yes, I do believe that the pandemic has necessitated a different way. And we've been talking, not just Deloitte, but the industry has been talking a lot about the future of work, what the workplace will look like in 5-10 years time. I think pretty much we've seen over the last 3 months what the workplace will look like. It's going to be flexible. It's going to be technology enabled with platforms like Zoom, etc. And we will be a lot more of a transient population. But we still, as human beings, we have a need to connect. So there's going to be that flexible in office, out of office, teams meeting outside of the traditional office space, all enabled by tech. So I'm quite excited in terms of what the sort of post-COVID world will look like from a workplace as well as a tech perspective.
Well, so am I. It was actually the next question. It was the final question I was going to wrap up with, is the crystal ball. question is, the world according to Lani. What does
Post-COVID look like?
post-COVID look like?
Look, a lot of people, even internally, are saying that, we're all going to be remote work and no one's going to be in offices anymore. I actually disagree, right? I take and this is, given my background in psychology and working as a therapist in my outside hours, people have an innate need to connect. And when I mean connect, not just over video platforms, we have an innate need to connect physically. And we could go talk another hour or so into the research around proximity and how humans interact when we're in close proximity to each other. And that's been built over millions of years of evolution. It's in our, almost, as you can say, it's in our DNA, right? And again, you could look at neuroscience in terms of what happens in the brain when humans get close together, etc., and how I think how that sort of drives innovation, new ideas, etc. So I think there's still going to be a need for humans to interact and connect, together in groups, essentially. But we will use platforms like Zoom, etc., to supplement that, to complement that. So this whole traditional thought process of Lee's not at his desk, he must be slacking off at the beach or whatever it is. That's completely flipped now in terms of Lee's not at his desk, but if he's meeting the outcomes that we need from him, well then, regardless of where he works from, that will be okay. So I think it's going to be now a very flexible, sort of fluid movement between meeting face to face and meeting over platforms like this.
Yeah. So, I mean, that is an interesting point, isn't it? The idea that if I'm visible in my cubicle, somehow I'm productive. That's sort of a mentality that comes out of the Industrial Revolution, isn't it?
Yeah.
Line people up in desks, oversight. That's how you build productivity, right?
Yeah.
And then this idea that says, well, actually, if we measure the outcome, I used to say to my when I was running, sales teams, is saying, look, if you're good enough to hit your quota, exceed your quota by 20 or 30%, and you go and sit on the beach on Friday. Good luck to you.
Yeah, I know.
Right?
Good luck to you, right? You'll be happier and you will get more productivity out of you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Lani, thanks very much for talking with us today. It's been fantastic.
It's a pleasure, Lee. It's been a pleasure.
People can connect with you on LinkedIn.
On LinkedIn and Twitter. Yeah, that's probably the best way to connect them with me.
Right. Okay, mate. Thanks very much for talking with us, and
thank you, Lee.
We'll take that partnership conversation offline.
Offline, absolutely. All righty.
All right, mate. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Talk to you soon. Bye.